Now that we have all group theoretical prerequisites in place, the actual construction of group convolutions is actually really simple. And so we're going to show that. And in order to get some decent intuition, we stick to a template matching viewpoint. And I'll illustrate this as follows. But first, let's start off with revisiting the formulation of convolution, or actually cross-correlation, I must say. So what is seen over here is the cross-correlation of a kernel K with a function f. And it's defined as this integral transform, where we translate the kernel to a position x, and then take this inner product, so this integral, and multiplying the kernel with the function value f. And as many deep learners like me, I'm going to mix up quite often the terminology, calling this is indeed a cross-correlation, but I might occasionally also call it a convolution. And this mistake, I don't think it's a bad mistake, because convolutions and cross-correlations are essentially one and the same. It's just that a convolution is a cross-correlation with reflected convolution kernels and the other way around. So I guess it's fine to mix up these terminologies. But strictly speaking, what is written over here is a cross-correlation. So as mentioned, what this represents is really a shift of a convolution kernel or a correlation kernel K by a translation amount. So we can let the representation of the translation group act on the kernel to shift it to a different point in space, and then take the inner product with the function f. And the inner product can be thought of as quantifying the similarity between the shifted kernel and the underlying signal, right? Just like vectors. If you take the inner product, you can relate it to a cosine similarity. So that essentially means that we can regard this cross-correlation operator as a form of template matching, where K is the templates which we're matching with our function f under all possible translations. So it looks like this. So K is a convolution kernel or a template, and this is the underlying feature map f, and we're just translating this kernel all over the image, and every time we take the inner product to see if there's a match. And whenever there's a match, so it's aligned with the structure, you see, that's the same type of direction of this edge, we get a high response and we get a low response otherwise. So yeah, convolutions can be thought of as template matching, and these convolution kernels then indeed represent the feature that you're that you're trying to find within these feature maps. Now, via this construction, by defining the correlation operator via inner products with shifted kernels, it also becomes immediately obvious that these convolution or correlation operators are indeed translation equivariant. And this equivariance directly follows from the fact that we're working with linear operators exclusively. So the representation is linearly acting on K, and we have this inner product. And then by using this simple trick, that if I take the inner product, and well, maybe that's also a nice exercise to show. If I take the inner product of a function on the group shifted via the representation with another function f, then I can move this representation to the other side, to the other input, namely the f side, by multiplying or applying the inverse group representation on both sides. And that would cancel out, the LG applied to the kernel, so what's left is the kernel, and on the f side we have LG inverse f. So yeah, please verify this yourself, and then try proving indeed that this equivariance diagram holds. Okay, now this is a well-known result, and we also know that convolutions are generally not equivariant to rotor translations, meaning that if we rotate the input image and then apply the convolution, or first apply the convolution and then rotate it, the results are generally not the same, meaning that rotations and convolutions generally do not commute. And this is obvious from this point of view, where we see that the convolution or correlation operator is defined by the representation of the translation group. And here we're dealing with the rotation group, the representation of the rotation group. So there's, let's say, a mismatch between groups used in the construction of the correlation operator and what we're actually interested in. And so we're going to fix that. And a kind of intuitive and easy fix will be just to define the correlation operator via the group of rotations and translations. as to be able to make this commutation diagram work for both translations and rotations. Okay, so let's do that. So let's define a lifting correlation, which is then defined in a similar way. We have a convolution kernel K, which we're going to transform by the action of the rotate translation group, which rotates and translates it, and keep making these inner products, or measuring the similarity between the shifted kernel and the underlying signal. And I actually see that I made a typo over here. This should be a function of both x and theta, right? Because G, the group element is G. It represents a rotation and a translation, not just a translation. And that's also why we call it a lifting, because now we add a new axis, theta, to our output feature maps. So let's cross this out. This should be x comma theta over there. Okay, so let's make it a bit more concrete. So this transformation of the rotate translation group can be split into a part that rotates the kernel and a part that translates the kernel. And this is actually a result of working with semi-direct product groups. This is a form of an affine group introduced in the previous video. Okay, so we can write out this action a bit more explicitly, or these representations. So remember that the left regular representations, they transform the domain of these functions. So we first rotate the domain of K via an inverse rotation, and then we shift it via this translation vector. So rotation, translation. And I'm going to use this color coding where orange represents rotation and blue represents a translation. Okay, and then we keep making these inner products. So that looks something like this. So we have a core kernel K, which we can rotate via the action of the rotation group acting on K. So that's what you see happening here. So you see the kernel rotating step by step. And then the translation part, we're going to take care of that just simply by the conv2d operator, or just shifting this rotated kernel over space. And that actually, what you do then is matching this line segment everywhere in the image, and that picks up these structures, right? So whenever the line is aligned, we have a hit, a detection. And so we scan the entire image, and now you see that the feature map is no longer a feature map as a function of x and y. So we're not just matching for every possible translation, but we're also matching for all possible rotations. So now we add an extra axis to our feature map, which represents this subgroup of rotations. Right, so that's why we call this often a lifting group correlation or lifting convolution, because we add this extra theta axis to the feature maps. Okay, now using this definition, it's again not too hard to show that we can make this diagram commute if the convolution operator is defined as such, using the representation of both the rotation group and the translation group. We see that it doesn't matter if you first apply this lifting convolution and then rotate it, or first rotate it and then apply the convolution. But it is important to note here that before we apply this operation, we worked with functions f in L2 R2, so on position space, and here the output are functions f on L2 SE2 that live on the group. So we deal with different type of objects, a 2D image and a 3D feature map, position orientation space or rotation space feature map. That also means that in order to make such a commutation diagram, we need to define or need to know what is the action or the representation of, for example, the rotation group on 2D images. Well, we know that we just rotate the plane, but we also know how the rotation group acts onto the image. That's the notation that we use over here, right? The group acting on some object. This is then the left regular representation of it. And what you see over here is this action applied, so illustrated in this animation. So if I then rotate this object, then obviously the planar pattern rotates. So we have this planar rotation, but since the vertical axis encodes for orientation, and for example, this orange dot represents an orientation, for example, the nose pointing in a particular direction, then if I rotate this nose start pointing in different directions and thus ends up in a different slice of this position rotation space feature map. So we have a shift twist going on. So this planar rotation is generated by the action of SO2 on the planar part, on the spatial part of this feature map, and then this periodic shift is generated by the action of SO2 on the SO2 part of the group. And in the next slide, I'll give an explicit expression of this representation, but in essence, this immediately follows from the construction of semi-direct group product groups. So, okay, so yeah, we can make this diagram commute using lifting convolutions. But what next? So now we have these lifted feature maps. What kind of convolution operator are we going to use now? And of course, we're going to do the exact same thing as before, right? We just have a template which we're going to transform under the action of the rotor translation group. It's just that now I need to define how this representation transforms not 2D feature maps, but 3D feature maps, which have a position and a rotation component. And my apologies here again, I made this mistake. This should be x, theta, right? Because we're going to compute this inner product. The inner product just spits out a scalar value, and we're going to compute this inner product for all possible g is x, theta for all possible translations and rotations. Okay, so now we need to transform the kernel. Again, this representation split because of the semi-direct product group structure, which means that we first apply a rotation. Okay, so we rotate the planar part and we rotate the angular part. So this is really following from the definition of the group product, and this is following from the construction of the group acting on the 2D plane. And then we apply, in the same way as before, the shift, which we can do with a conv2D operator. Right, so now a kernel actually is a 3D kernel that assigns weights to relative orientations, much like this phase detector that we discussed in the previous video from this sort of recognition by component viewpoint. The phase is made out of these small parts, each which have their own orientation. So the nose is pointing in a particular direction, and the eyes are relatively oriented towards to the nose. So rotating means a planar rotation and a periodic shift. So we match this all over the image, and whenever we have a match of this pattern, so the nose is aligned, the eyes are aligned, and the contour is aligned, then we have a high response, and we have detected another phase. So you see in this example where there's two phases, which are represented in this lifted feature maps as such. Whenever both the spatial locations are aligned and the angular rotation patterns are aligned, we have a high response, and so we detected two peaks where this three-dimensional pattern exactly matches. Okay, and this is then just shown for consistency, but it should be obvious that this group convolution operators again commute. So I can first apply the group convolution and then shift it again, or first shift and then apply the group convolution. And this is important to know, to have this property, because it tells us that if the input would be transformed, then all information stays within the neural network. It's just shifted to different location, and a different location could mean a different location in the plane and the spatial part, and it could be different orientation. It's just the information stays within the network, and that's important to have. So we covered three types of convolutions now. We had the classic convolution, which was just template matching of a kernel, which is translated by the action of the translation group on these kernels, and we do this inner product, this template matching, and those are then these integral transforms. But if we wanted to have this correlation or convolution operator to be equivalent to both rotations and translations, then we had to use the representation of the rotor translation group. But the shape of this equation stays exactly the same. It's just template matching with the kernel transformed via the group. And then equally we defined the group correlation, so template matching between three-dimensional kernels and the underlying feature maps F. And I'm really sorry here, I should have fixed the slide, so everywhere you see x, theta, and this is actually really important to realize, right? That here we generate two-dimensional feature maps that assign to every position, every translation, a response. Here we generate higher dimensional feature maps which assign to every translation and every rotation angle a response, and the same now for the subsequent group convolutions. But here the input is already a three-dimensional feature map, but here the input is a 2D feature map. Which means that here we take the inner product over R2, we integrate over R2, dx. Here we integrate over SE2, R2, S1, integrate over dx, so there should actually also be a d theta over there. Okay, this is then what a general group convolutional neural network then looks like. So we start off with a lifting layer, followed by group convolution layers and possibly a projection layer. And it goes a bit like this. So suppose we have an input feature map in which there are pattern visible made out of, let's say, local line segments. Then we can pick up all these local line segments with filters like edge detectors or line detectors, which we're going to rotate and then match in the image. And that generates these three-dimensional feature maps. And we have a lot of them, like the number of channels that you usually have in a convnet. And each channel represents a feature detected under different poses in the image. And so now the group convolutions are then not done by just 2D convolution kernels, but by three-dimensional kernels that assign to every relative pose, like position and orientation, a particular weight. So now we can detect very complicated patterns of relative poses. If we want to detect a face, I would like to see a nose in a particular orientation, and then the eyes and the mouth all at some relative orientation to it. And in that sense, it also solves the Picasso problem, right? If I see a face and some eyes, a nose, and a mouth, I would like not to see an eye at the right location, but also at the right orientation, right? So now we have two eyes at the right location, a nose, let's say at a different location, and a mouth also in a different location. Obviously, these are different figures, and this looks completely odd, of course, even though the eyes and the nose and the mouth are all at the same location. So with group convolutions, you can simultaneously check whether these patterns are indeed at the right poses relative to each other. Okay, so moving on. So then these group convolution layers indeed detect these more advanced patterns. For example, a face at this location and orientation, and a face at a different orientation. Right, this one is rotated relative to that one. And if you want to be completely invariant to the precise orientation of the face, I just want to know, is there a face in the image? Then I take a max projection, for example, or a mean pooling over this vertical axis. And then I have a 2D feature map again that says, okay, I detected a face at this location. I don't remember anymore which orientation because I pooled over this axis and the same over here. So we have actually recovered an invariant, a locally invariant shape detector based on equivariant features. And this idea then also holds for different type of groups, right? So I can also reason about objects based on scale and position. So a face can be thought of as being composed of a big blob, the contour of the face, eyes have some size, the nose and the mouth have some size, all relative to each other, and I can scale up this pattern. And I can detect this pattern under different, so for example, a blob detector, I can apply it at different scales, and that would create a high dimensional feature map, and that assigns a weight for every position and for every scale. And this relative configuration of points is just expanded in a predictable way using the group theory. So now again, we can apply group convolutions to detect these more advanced patterns based on by detecting patterns of relative poses of these core building blocks, like these blobs. And that would allow me to detect a face at a certain size at this location and at a larger size at this location. And if I'm not interested in the precise size, only the location, then I could do again a pooling over this subgroup axis, just like you would do in an invariant classifier, which is supposed to be shift invariant. You usually end your neural network with a pooling over the spatial axis to come up with one feature value or one prediction that says something about the content of the entire image. So something similar we do here by just pooling over the orientation axis. And if we just want to know, was there a face in this image, then I also pool over the spatial axis. Okay, so here's a summary. So group convolutional neural networks intuitively perform template matching, right? Where a template or a kernel is transformed and matched using the inner product under all possible transformations in the group. And this generates higher dimensional feature maps or functions on the group on which we can again define template matching via the group action. So we add an axis that encodes for the local pose, let's say, of the feature. And now in these higher dimensional feature maps, we can start detecting patterns in terms of features at relative poses. And this relates to the idea of recognition by components, right? That we touched upon in the previous video. And now what's important, of course, is that group convolutional neural networks are based on equivariant layers, and thus they allow for weight sharing. And simultaneously, they can provide guarantees of invariance if I do some pooling in the end. But especially this notion of weight sharing that touches upon what we see in nature, right? That we tend to be more efficient in a representation learning if we leverage all these symmetries that we see in the data.